The room was silent, the tension almost unbearable. You could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes focused on one person, the black entrepreneur standing in front of a panel of business leaders. He'd worked his entire life for this moment, built his company from the ground up, and this meeting was supposed to be the next big step in his career. But what happened next was far from what he expected. His pitch had been meticulously prepared, his passion undeniable, yet something felt off as the conversation took an unexpected turn. He had entered the meeting with excitement, believing that all his hard work had finally brought him to the right place, surrounded by potential investors who saw his vision. But as he spoke, he noticed something in their eyes, a subtle dismissal. Maybe it was just his imagination, he thought at first. But as the minutes ticked by, the condescending looks, the raised eyebrows, and the dismissive comments became too obvious to ignore. His words, his ideas, even his very presence, seemed to be nothing more than a spectacle for their amusement. It wasn't just a business meeting anymore. It felt personal. He could tell they didn't take him seriously, not because of his ideas or the quality of his work, but because of who he was. He tried to brush it off, focusing on the pitch, the facts, and the numbers he'd carefully prepared. But the environment shifted. Every attempt to steer the conversation back to the merits of his proposal was met with sarcastic remarks or irrelevant questions. It felt like they were more interested in undermining him than listening to what he had to say. And then it happened. One of the investors made a comment, an offhand remark that seemed to be disguised as a joke but hit hard nonetheless. It was a comment that questioned his intelligence, his background, and his very place at the table. The room chuckled lightly, and for a moment he froze. His heart raced, his mind scrambled for a response, but the words didn't come. All he could do was stand there, feeling the weight of the humiliation sinking in. But here's where the story takes a twist, because in that moment, when it seemed like all was lost, he didn't back down. What happened next in the meeting wasn't just about a business deal or a career. It was about something far more important. Something that no one in that room was prepared for. The entrepreneur, despite the humiliation, wasn't going to leave the room defeated. Instead, he made a decision that would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone in that room. What happened after that moment of tension will leave you speechless. This is the story of resilience, determination, and what happens when you refuse to let anyone define your worth. Stay tuned, because the next part of this journey is nothing short of a game changer. The air was thick with discomfort, a palpable unease that seemed to wrap around the room. The panel of investors exchanged glances, clearly expecting some sort of reaction. They were used to seeing entrepreneurs squirm under pressure, especially when faced with the sharp edge of their critiques. This was a familiar game to them, a power play, a subtle dance of superiority that, in their eyes, kept the balance of control in their hands. The black entrepreneur, standing before them, was a mere player in this game, and they were confident that their authority would go unchallenged. But little did they know, they had underestimated him. He hadn't always been in this position, standing in a sleek conference room, facing an array of powerful individuals whose every word seemed designed to belittle. His journey had been long, filled with setbacks and challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. Growing up, he'd never had the privileges that others took for granted. His family had struggled, scraping by in a neighborhood where hope often seemed out of reach. But his mother had always taught him one thing: the world might not be fair, but that didn't mean he couldn't fight for what he deserved. Determined to break free from the cycle of hardship, he poured every ounce of energy into his education. Books became his escape, and school was his battleground. He didn't have the luxury of private tutors or summer vacations in lavish destinations. Instead, he spent his nights studying, researching, and building the skills that would one day carry him to the top. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but that only made him work harder. There was no room for failure, not if he wanted to create something of his own, something that could change his life forever. Fast forward to the present, and here he was, standing before this panel of investors, a far cry from young boy who had barely scraped by. His business had grown from a small idea into something tangible, something real. He had created a company that not only provided a unique product but also empowered others like him who had been overlooked and underestimated. The fact that he had made it this far was a testament to his grit, to his unwavering belief that success wasn't about where you came from, but what you were willing to fight for. Yet, despite his accomplishments, there were moments like this one that reminded him of the battles still ahead. The subtle biases, the moments when he could feel the eyes on him, judging him for reasons that had nothing to do with his abilities or achievements. It was the kind of thing that made him question if he was ever going to truly be seen for who he was, not just what he represented in the eyes of others. As the awkward silence stretched on, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He refused to let their disdain show. Instead, he focused on his goal, the reason he was there in the first place. He had worked too hard for too long to let a few judgmental remarks derail his mission. But there was a burning question in the back of his mind: how much longer could he keep fighting this battle? The truth was, the business world was a battlefield, and while he had been winning some battles, there were still so many more to face. And then, something strange happened. As the investor who had made the initial snide remark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the entrepreneur locked eyes with him. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no outward display of anger or frustration. It was something deeper. It was the quiet confidence that came from years of struggle and sacrifice. The kind of confidence that said, "I've been through worse than this, and I'll keep pushing forward." He didn't have to say anything. His presence alone spoke volumes. The tension in the room shifted slightly, though no one could pinpoint exactly why. The investor, once smug, seemed to falter for just a moment, as if unsure of how to proceed. For a second, it almost felt like he realized that the entrepreneur wasn't going to crumble under the weight of his criticism. That he wasn't just another figure to belittle or dismiss. The moment passed quickly, but not without leaving a trace. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The entrepreneur pressed on with his pitch, speaking clearly and confidently about his company's vision, the unique opportunities in the market, and the potential for growth. But even as he spoke, he couldn't help but feel the weight of their judgment. Their eyes were on him, and though they may have been pretending to listen, he knew they weren't hearing him in the way he deserved. They were listening to his race, his background, his identity, not his ideas. He could feel the subtle, unspoken biases creeping into the conversation again. But he was determined to stay focused. As the meeting dragged on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being played. It wasn't about the business anymore, it was about proving something to them, about making them see him, not just as an entrepreneur, but as a person. He had already proven he could run a successful business, but here, in this room, it felt like he was still fighting for respect. Just as he was about to wrap up, a voice from across the table interrupted him. The same investor who had made the earlier comment, now with a different tone, asked a question that seemed harmless at first. "So tell us," he began, "how do you plan to scale this business? What's your strategy for attracting top-tier investors?" The question seemed innocent enough, but the way it was asked, almost like a test, a challenge to his credibility, sent a chill down his spine. He had dealt with this kind of questioning before, but there was something about the way it was phrased that felt particularly condescending. It was as if they didn't believe someone like him, someone with his background, could truly have the vision to scale a successful business. For a moment he paused. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger building inside him. But he knew that responding with hostility wouldn't help his cause. He had to play this game carefully. He couldn't afford to let them see him lose his composure. Instead, he took another breath and calmly responded, explaining his plans for scaling the business, emphasizing his innovative strategies, and outlining the market research that supported his approach. But even as he spoke, he could see their faces, those skeptical expressions, the slight smirks, the dismissive glances. It was clear that they weren't convinced. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He realized that no matter how many facts he presented, no matter how well he explained his vision, there was always going to be a wall between them. A wall built on prejudice, on assumptions, on the fact that they didn't believe he belonged in the same room as them. The final moments of the meeting felt like a blur. He tried to hold on to his composure, but the feeling of frustration, of being unheard, was overwhelming. He knew he had done everything right, but it didn't matter. They had made up their minds. The entrepreneur stood up to shake their hands, a final attempt at maintaining professionalism, but there was no warmth in the exchange. No acknowledgement of his hard work, his vision, or his worth. Just polite smiles and empty pleasantries. As he left the room, the door closing behind him, he couldn't help but feel the sting of rejection. But as he stepped into a hallway, away from the cold, sterile atmosphere of the conference room, he made a decision. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. He wasn't going to let these investors or anyone else define his worth. He had come too far to turn back now. And the road ahead, while uncertain, was one he was determined to walk. But little did he know, the fallout from this meeting would spark a chain of events that would change the course of his career and his life forever. The story was far from over. The real challenge had only just begun. What came next was something no one could have predicted. And as the mystery of his journey deepened, so did the stakes. Would he rise to the challenge, or would this meeting be the one that finally broke him? The next part of his story would reveal the true strength of his character, and how far he was willing to go to prove that he belonged at the table. But for now, the tension remained unresolved, and the uncertainty loomed large. What would he do next? The answer was coming. But it was far from what anyone expected. As the entrepreneur walked down the corridor, the sharp click of his shoes against the polished floor echoed in his ears, a stark contrast to the hollow silence of the conference room he had just left. The weight of the meeting pressed down on him, and with every step, a creeping doubt began to settle in his mind. He had done everything right. He had given his pitch, presented his vision, laid out a plan for success, but it hadn't been enough. Not because of his ideas, but because of who he was. Because of how they saw him. He stopped in his tracks, briefly closing his eyes as he exhaled deeply. The sting of the dismissal was real, a bitter reminder that even in today's world, barriers still existed. But it wasn't just the investors who were the problem. It was the system, the culture, the very structures in place that made it harder for someone like him to be taken seriously. There was a deeper fight at play, one that extended far beyond any single business deal. It was the fight for recognition, for equality, for a seat at the table. The kind of fight that didn't end with a failed meeting or a rejected pitch. It was a fight that would take years, maybe decades, to win. But as he stood there in the quiet hallway, one thing was clear: he wasn't going to give up. The feeling of humiliation was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the drive that surged within him. He wasn't just building a business. He was breaking down walls, creating space for others who had been overlooked, marginalized, and underestimated. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from his partner, someone who had been with him through every step of this journey. The message was short but to the point. How'd it go? He stared at the screen for a moment, the words running through his mind. Should he tell the truth? Should he share how he felt, how nothing in that room had been about business, but about him being different? About how his every word had been scrutinized, not for its value, but because of who he was? He typed a quick reply, "I'll explain later. I'm good." He knew it wasn't the full story. But right now, he didn't have the energy to unpack it all. There was too much at stake. The meeting might have been a setback, but it wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Still, the moment of self-doubt lingered as he made his way out of the building and into the cool night air. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the streets hummed with life. But all he could think about was the look on their faces, the condescension, the skepticism, the subtle but unmistakable disregard. They had seen him as just another person who didn't belong in that space, no matter how many achievements he had under his belt. It was a harsh reminder that the fight for acceptance wasn't just about proving your worth through hard work and merit. It was about breaking through generations of biases and prejudices that ran deep in the system. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how far-reaching the problem was. It wasn't just the investors who needed to change their perspective, it was the entire industry. The world of entrepreneurship, especially in tech and business, was still a place where opportunities were unequally distributed. How many other talented black entrepreneurs had been turned away, ignored, or forced to prove themselves more than their counterparts? How many people had been dismissed, not because their ideas lacked value, but because their race or background made them seem unworthy of trust or opportunity? As he sat in his car, staring out at the passing cityscape, a spark of determination flared within him. This wasn't just about one meeting. This was about a bigger mission, a mission to change the way people thought about success, about potential, about who deserved a chance to succeed. It was about creating a space where individuals from all walks of life, no matter their background or identity, could stand on equal footing and be judged for what they brought to the table, not who they were when they walked through the door. But for now, he had to deal with the aftermath of the meeting. He still had to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward. This wasn't the first time he had faced rejection, and it wouldn't be the last. But with every failure, there was a lesson. And he was learning fast. As the next few days passed, the feeling of humiliation began to shift into something else, something more purposeful. He started to gather his thoughts, reflecting on what had happened and why. He couldn't let this experience define him. He couldn't let it shape his journey or become an obstacle that stood in his way. If anything, he had to use it as fuel. He had to find a way to turn this setback into an opportunity, not just for himself, but for others who had been through the same struggles. He reached out to his network friends, mentors, fellow entrepreneurs who had faced similar challenges. Some offered words of encouragement, while others shared their own experiences of rejection and bias. Slowly, he realized that he wasn't alone. This was a shared struggle, one that many people had faced before him, and one that would continue unless something changed. But there was power in that realization. There was strength in unity. Meanwhile, the investors from the meeting had moved on, too, continuing their search for the next big thing. They weren't thinking about him. To them, he was just another entrepreneur who hadn't quite fit the mold. But what they didn't know was that he had already started working on something new, a new strategy, a new pitch, a new way to approach the business world. And this time, he was going to play their game on his own terms. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was long, and the obstacles were many. But the more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He was going to show them all that he wasn't just another entrepreneur trying to fit into their world. He was going to create his own. And the best part? It wasn't going to be built on their rules. It was going to be built on his. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension still simmered beneath the surface. The entrepreneur knew he had to act fast. He couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. And yet, despite his plans and his growing sense of purpose, there was a nagging feeling that the investors weren't done with him. Maybe they hadn't taken him seriously before, but something told him that they would be watching, waiting for his next move. Would they try to make him prove himself again, or would they be forced to reconsider their assumptions? For now, that question hung in the air, unresolved. And as the mystery of what would happen next deepened, the stakes grew higher. What came next in his journey would either solidify his path forward or force him to confront even bigger challenges he hadn't yet begun to imagine. The weeks that followed were a blur of planning, strategizing, and reworking his approach. The entrepreneur threw himself into his work, his focus unwavering. He knew that the rejection from the meeting was just a single chapter in a much larger story. Yet the sting of it didn't fade. Every time he sat down to craft a new pitch or refine his business model, that moment in the conference room replayed in his mind. The dismissive glances, the smirks that lingered just a little too long, the sense of being underestimated, it was all still fresh, still burning. He refused to let it define him, though. He had always known that breaking barriers would take time. But now, more than ever, he understood the depths of the challenge. It wasn't just about getting funding or making deals, it was about proving, time and again, that his vision, his work, his worth was just as valid as anyone else's. And that meant pushing harder, proving himself more, and being prepared for the fight of his life. As the days turned into weeks, he found himself surrounded by a growing support network, other entrepreneurs, activists, and mentors who had weathered similar storms. They shared their stories, their struggles, their victories, and their defeats. It was in these conversations that he found the strength to keep going. But even as he received encouragement from those who had been there before, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing, something that would require more than just hard work and perseverance. There were moments when it felt like everything was aligning perfectly. New doors opened. Connections were made. Ideas flowed more freely than ever before. But with each new opportunity, the weight of the previous meeting hung over him. It was as if he were being tested, pushed to prove that he had what it took to rise above the doubts that others had placed on him. It wasn't enough to succeed on his own terms, he had to make sure the world saw him on his terms, too. Then, out of nowhere, an unexpected phone call arrived. It was from a different group of investors, one that had been watching from the sidelines, quietly observing. They had heard the rumors, seen the public pushback, and sensed the momentum that was building around him. There was an opening, an invitation to pitch again, but this time, it would be different. These investors weren't just interested in his idea, they were looking at him as a person. They had seen the buzz, the energy he had cultivated, and they wanted in. But there was a catch. The catch wasn't in the terms of the deal, it was in the stakes. The investors weren't interested in a typical pitch meeting. No, they had something much bigger in mind. They wanted him to present his business at a massive networking event, one that attracted the most influential people in the industry. It wasn't just an opportunity to pitch his idea, it was an opportunity to prove, once and for all, that he belonged in this world. To prove that his vision was worth backing. To prove that he wasn't just another entrepreneur in the shadows, but a force to be reckoned with. The pressure was immense. He had been in front of investors before, had faced the scrutiny of countless meetings, but this was different. This wasn't just about making a deal, it was about rewriting the narrative. The narrative that he was an outsider, an underdog. The narrative that success wasn't meant for people like him. He had little time to prepare, and every moment felt like an eternity. His mind raced as he revised his pitch, refining every detail, preparing for the hardest presentation of his life. The weight of it was overwhelming. He knew that the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This wasn't just about funding, this was about changing the game. But the deeper he dove into his preparations, the more intense the pressure became. There were whispers in the industry, rumors about whether he could pull it off, about whether he could overcome the doubts that had followed him from that disastrous meeting. As the event drew closer, he began to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. It wasn't just about proving his worth, it was about proving that he could outlast the obstacles, that he could face the resistance head-on and come out stronger. But with each passing day, it became clearer, the fear of failure wasn't the only thing that haunted him. It was the fear of letting down everyone who had placed their trust in him, the partners, the supporters, the community that had rallied around him. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let himself down. The night before the event, he found himself alone in his office, staring at his laptop screen. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional click of the keyboard as he made final adjustments to his presentation. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. The pitch was perfect. His message was clear. But as he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, the tension in his chest refused to subside. Tomorrow would be the defining moment. Tomorrow would decide everything. The chance to prove himself, to show the world what he was capable of, had arrived. And yet, despite all his preparation, there was still a nagging feeling and uncertainty that lingered in the back of his mind. What if the room still wasn't ready for someone like him? What if the investors still couldn't see beyond the surface? What if this was just another hurdle, another challenge that couldn't be overcome? The clock ticked on, the night growing later, and the uncertainty remained. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't rest. Not when the weight of everything he had worked for was so close, and yet so far. Tomorrow would change everything. But would it change in his favor? As the night dragged on, the tension mounted. He knew that the world would be watching. They would be waiting, not just to hear his pitch, but to see how he handled the pressure. This was his chance to rewrite his story, to prove to everyone who had ever doubted him that he belonged in the conversation. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow, for better or worse, was going to be the biggest challenge of his life. The next morning arrived in a blur of nerves and anticipation. The entrepreneur stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with a mixture of resolve and doubt. He had done everything to prepare. His pitch was flawless. His passion for his business was undeniable. This was his moment. Yet, as he dressed and gathered his things, a strange feeling lingered, something that gnawed at the back of his mind. It was a familiar sensation, one that had haunted him ever since that fateful meeting. It wasn't just the fear of failure. It was the nagging thought that even if he succeeded today, there would always be another obstacle waiting around the corner, another hurdle to jump. He tried to shake the thought, telling himself that today was different. He had already come so far. The hard work, the late nights, the sacrifice, it would all pay off in a few hours. Still, a voice deep inside whispered that nothing in this world came easy. He had to earn his place, every single step of the way. As he arrived at the event, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. The room was filled with successful entrepreneurs, influential investors, and eager startup founders. The event had a reputation for launching careers, but it was also known for weeding out those who couldn't handle the heat. It was a high-stakes environment, and everyone was watching everyone else. Eyes shifted, conversations quieted, and the weight of expectations hung in the air like a storm about to break. The entrepreneur's turn was fast approaching, but something unexpected happened just as he was preparing to walk up to the stage. He received a text. It was from a close business mentor, someone who had been guiding him through this entire journey. The message was short but to the point: be careful. There's a lot at stake today. Someone in the room is planning to sabotage you. His heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, rereading it over and over. Sabotage? Who would want to undermine him, especially now, at the moment he had worked so hard for? His mind raced, but he couldn't afford to lose focus. He had to keep moving. But who could he trust? Who had the motive to take him down? The text gnawed at him as he stepped into the spotlight, his nerves surging again. The room went silent as he began his pitch. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of it. Every word felt important. Every glance from the audience felt like a judgment. Yet as he spoke, the initial nervousness slowly faded, and he fell into the rhythm of his message. This was what he had prepared for. This was his chance to show everyone that he belonged here. Just as he was nearing the end of his pitch, something strange happened. One of the investors, someone who had been quiet throughout the event, suddenly raised a hand and interrupted him. The entrepreneur paused, momentarily thrown off. The room held its breath. Was there a question? A comment? The tension in the air was thick, like a lid about to pop off a pressure cooker. The investor's voice cut through the silence, cold and deliberate. I don't believe in what you're selling. I don't believe in you. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to freeze, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a direct attack on his credibility, his ideas, his very existence as a legitimate entrepreneur. A ripple of murmurs swept through the audience, and for a split second, he questioned whether he could recover. This was his worst fear coming to life. But then, a voice inside him broke through the noise. He couldn't let this moment define him. Not now, not after everything he had been through. His vision was too important. His mission was too powerful to let one voice drown it out. He took a breath, steadied himself, and responded. I understand you might have doubts, he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. But I'm not here to ask for your belief. I'm here to show you what I've built, what I'm creating, and what I will continue to create regardless of the challenges I face. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. There was something in his voice, something raw and unfiltered that drew them in. They could feel the passion in his words, the determination that ran deeper than just business. This wasn't about money. This wasn't just about success. It was about creating a legacy, proving that he belonged, and showing that no one, not even those with power and influence, could tear him down. As he wrapped up his presentation, he felt the weight of that unexpected interruption. The sabotage. The challenge. But he had held his ground. He had shown them what he was made of. Still, there was no denying the reality of the situation. The clock was ticking, and the investors would soon make their decisions. He had done everything he could, but now, it was out of his hands. The event ended, and the entrepreneurs began to filter out of the room, each of them carrying their own hopes and fears. But as the entrepreneur walked out, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The sabotage hadn't been a fluke, it had been calculated. He could feel it in his bones. Someone had tried to take him down, but he had survived. But who was behind it? And what would they do next? His phone buzzed again. It was another message from his mentor, "You're not done yet. The real test is coming. Keep your eyes open." His stomach tightened. He had fought for his place at the table. But now, the true battle was just beginning. The days following the event felt like an eternity. The entrepreneur couldn't shake the weight of the investor's interruption. The harsh words still echoed in his mind, and every corner of his life felt haunted by the uncertainty of whether his dream would slip away. But he kept going, pushing forward, focusing on his work, determined to make something of himself regardless of the setbacks. Still, there was a nagging sense that something was off. He had barely slept, constantly replaying the meeting, looking for signs that he had missed, clues that could explain the sabotage. Who would want to destroy his chance so publicly? Why target him when so many others were competing for the same opportunity? The questions burned in his mind, and the more he tried to silence them, the louder they became. Then, the unexpected happened. He got a call one afternoon, a number he didn't recognize. At first, he hesitated. Another investor? A potential client? A competitor trying to get under his skin? But curiosity got the best of him, and he answered. What he heard next nearly knocked the wind out of him. It was the investor who had rejected him so publicly. The one who had called out his pitch, who had humiliated him in front of everyone. But this time, there was no cold, dismissive tone. There was an urgency in the voice, almost pleading. I need to meet with you, the investor said, his voice tinged with regret. And this time, it's not about business. I was wrong. The entrepreneur's heart skipped a beat. What could this mean? After everything that had happened, why would this investor suddenly want to meet? Was this another part of the game, another attempt to take him down? He was torn, unsure whether to trust this unexpected turn of events. But curiosity and a small spark of hope pushed him to agree. The meeting was set for later that week. He walked into the conference room, his mind racing with possibilities. He had no idea what to expect, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. The investor was already seated, looking tense, as if the weight of his decision was heavy on his shoulders. I owe you an apology, the investor began, his voice quieter than before. What I said at the event. I didn't mean it. And I've spent the last few days regretting it. But I need to explain. The entrepreneur didn't say anything, unsure whether to believe him or not. But the investor continued, clearly battling with his own conscience. You see, I've been involved in some shady business dealings, things that I'm not proud of, the investor admitted, his eyes lowering. I've sabotaged people before, just like I tried with you. It was never personal. But I saw something in you. Your determination. Your vision. And I didn't want to let someone like you succeed. The words hit the entrepreneur like a punch to the gut. He had been right all along. The sabotage, the cruelty, it had all been a calculated attempt to bring him down, fueled by the investor's own insecurities and fears of losing control. But there was something else in the investor's confession that made his head spin. The investor wasn't just trying to tear him down. He was also revealing something darker, something that ran deeper than just a competitive rivalry. I thought I could crush you before you even had a chance, the investor said, his voice shaking. But now, I see what I almost destroyed. I've been given a second chance. And I want to help you. The words hung in the air, as the entrepreneur struggled to make sense of it all. This wasn't the apology he expected. It wasn't even close to what he had imagined. Could he trust this man, the one who had tried to ruin him? Could he allow himself to accept the offer of help? Before he could process everything, the investor reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a document. This is my offer, the investor said, sliding it across the table. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want you to have this opportunity to make things right. The entrepreneur stared at the paper in disbelief. It was an investment offer, a large one, far bigger than any he had ever dreamed of. And it came with conditions that seemed almost too good to be true. But the deal wasn't what shocked him most, it was the way the investor had shifted from antagonist to ally in the blink of an eye. He was still processing everything, still unsure if he could believe what had just transpired when the final twist hit. The investor's eyes widened as he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There's one last thing you need to know, he said, his voice tense. The people I work with. They won't let you get away that easily. This might seem like a genuine offer, but it's part of a bigger game. They've been watching you. They'll test you, push you, and maybe even try to stop you. But now, you'll be in the crosshairs. And if you want to make it through this, you have to play their game better than anyone else. If you don't, I'll be the one left standing. The revelation sent a chill down the entrepreneur's spine. It was no longer just about proving his business idea. It was about surviving the web of power, deceit, and manipulation that had been spun around him. He thought the worst was over, but now, it was clear that he was only at the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous battle. The offer lay on the table before him, a lifeline wrapped in a dangerous package. He knew he couldn't walk away from this chance, it was everything he had worked for. But the stakes had just gone through the roof, and the real fight was only beginning. As the entrepreneur stood up, holding the document in his hand, he felt the weight of the decision press on him. He had made it this far, but at what cost? And could he really trust anyone, even now, when the game had just become far more treacherous? The door to the room closed behind him, and he stepped into the unknown, unsure whether he was walking toward victory or deeper into a trap that could destroy everything he had worked for. And just as he stepped out into the hallway, his phone buzzed again. Another message. "It's your move. Don't waste it." The game had only just begun. The message sat on the entrepreneur's phone screen, the words as cold as ice, "It's your move. Don't waste it." His pulse quickened. The gravity of this situation was settling in, and he realized that everything he had worked for could either flourish or crumble based on the next decision he made. He glanced at the document still in his hand, the terms seemingly perfect, yet there was a dark undercurrent to it all. How much of the investor's offer was genuine, and how much of it was part of a larger game, one he was still trying to understand? He walked out of the building, the weight of the paper heavier than any of the business deals he had navigated before. His mind raced through the possibilities. Should he sign it? Could he trust someone who had been so willing to ruin him before? And if he did accept, what were the real costs of success? The next few days were filled with silence, interrupted only by calls from his team, updates on his business, and occasional check-ins from friends. But his thoughts always circled back to that conversation. The investor had apologized, admitted his mistakes, and offered an olive branch, but something about it didn't feel right. It was as if the apology was just another part of the strategy, a clever ploy to reel him in. And then came the final blow. The one thing he hadn't anticipated. A message from an unknown source popped up on his phone late one night, long after his team had gone home for the day. The message was simple: "He's playing you. Don't trust him." The entrepreneur's heart skipped a beat. Who could have sent this? Was it a warning from someone who wanted to see him fail, or was it the first real sign that something truly nefarious was at play? The doubt, the suspicion, it all felt overwhelming. He turned to his closest confidant, a trusted mentor who had helped him navigate countless challenges in the past. Sitting across from him in a quiet CAF, he told the mentor everything: the rejection, the apology, the offer. His voice cracked with frustration as he admitted, "I don't know who to trust anymore. It feels like the entire world is playing a game, and I'm the pawn." His mentor, who had been silent throughout the recount, looked up at him with calm eyes. "It's not about trust," the mentor said quietly. "It's about understanding the game. You're not a pawn, you're a player. And right now, you need to decide whether you want to be in control of the moves, or let someone else dictate them for you." The words hit home. For the first time since the meeting, he realized something crucial: he wasn't a victim of the system, he was a participant. Every decision he made from here on out would either empower him or diminish him. No more looking for validation. No more second-guessing his worth. He had built his business from the ground up, fought to be seen and heard, and now, it was time to rise above the challenges. The following morning, he called the investor's office. The decision was made. He would meet one last time. No more hesitation, no more uncertainty. He would face the investor, face to face, and make it clear that he was done being part of someone else's game. As he sat across from the investor once again, the tension in the room was palpable. But this time, there was no doubt in his voice. He knew what he wanted, and he wasn't afraid to say it. "I've made my decision," he said firmly, folding the document back into the envelope. "I won't be part of this game any longer." The investor's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake. You could have everything. All the resources? All the connections. I don't need your resources if they come with strings attached," the entrepreneur replied, his voice unwavering. "And I don't need anyone who thinks I'm just a pawn in their game." For a moment, the room was silent. The investor seemed to weigh his words, but when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone. I see. Maybe you're not as easy to manipulate as I thought. The entrepreneur stood, his decision final. Maybe. But that's because I've learned to control my own fate. As he walked out of the room, the weight that had burdened him for days lifted. He had taken control. He had decided that no investor, no competitor would define his success or his worth. He would carve his own path, regardless of the obstacles in his way. In the months that followed, the entrepreneur's business continued to grow, but more importantly, so did his understanding of the game. He learned to recognize the players, the deals, and the manipulation. He built his business on his own terms, surrounded by people who respected him, not because of what he could offer them, but because of who he was. The story that began with humiliation and uncertainty ended with empowerment and self-discovery. The key takeaway was clear: true success isn't about winning the game set by others, it's about learning to play by your own rules. And while the road may be full of challenges, the most important thing was never losing sight of who you are and what you stand for. As for the investor? His words still echoed in the entrepreneur's mind. I see. Maybe you're not as easy to manipulate as I thought. But it was the last message he received from the unknown source that really stuck with him. You were never a pawn. You were always the king. It was a reminder that no matter what, the entrepreneur had always been in control.